The silence that filled the house was heavy, almost palpable. Clara felt as though, with every step she took down the hallway, the air around her grew denser. The house had been frozen in time since Luisa, her 8-year-old daughter, had died in the accident. The small room at the end of the corridor, with its lavender-colored walls and neatly arranged toys, remained untouched. Clara couldn't bring herself to change anything. Any movement seemed a betrayal to her daughter's memory. She spent her days wandering through the rooms, reliving old moments, trapped in the endless loop of grief. She spoke to no one. Friends and family had tried for weeks to pull Clara out of her state, but she refused to listen. The thought of leaving the house, or even opening the windows to let sunlight in, felt unbearable. It was as if Luisa's presence was still there somehow. And Clara didn't want to push that away, no matter how painful it was. However, small events began to disturb the mournful stillness. The first time she heard the sound, she thought it was her imagination, a faint whisper, as if someone was calling her name. At first, it was so soft that she barely paid attention. But as the days passed, the whispers became more frequent. They came from Luisa's room, specifically at night when Clara was about to sleep. She forced herself to ignore them, convinced it was just the product of her grief-stricken mind, but the unease didn't go away. One morning, Clara entered her daughter's room and sensed something strange. Luisa's favorite doll, which was usually kept in the closet, was lying on the bed. She stood still, her heart pounding. She tried to recall if, for any reason, she herself had placed the toy there, but couldn't remember doing so. It must have been days ago, she thought, her mind still muddled from lack of sleep and the weight of her grief. Even so, the discomfort remained. Something was different in the atmosphere, a subtle change that she couldn't explain. Still deep in her sorrow, Clara tried to dismiss these signs, clinging to the idea that her sadness was warping her perception. That same night, as she lay down, the whispers returned, clearer this time. "Mom," said a familiar, almost affectionate voice. Clara sat up in bed, her body cold. "Luisa." She recognized the voice as her daughter's, though deep down, she knew it was impossible. A chill ran down her spine. Trying to calm her mind, Clara squeezed her eyes shut, muttering to herself that it was all just an illusion, a reflection of her pain. But the sound didn't stop. Luisa's voice seemed to be calling her, increasingly insistent, as if something or someone was waiting for her in the room she had forced herself to keep untouched. Clara spent the night wide awake. The sound of Luisa's voice echoed in her mind like a persistent refrain, mingling with the rapid beat of her heart. She knew it couldn't be real, but the clarity of the words, the familiarity of that little voice, made her doubts grow. Deep down, she wanted to believe it was just her grief manifesting in strange ways, that her mind was playing tricks on her, trying to fill the unbearable void. And yet, the voice didn't seem like a product of imagination. The next morning, Clara decided to investigate Luisa's room more thoroughly. When she opened the door, she was once again gripped by a sense of discomfort, an involuntary shiver. The doll was still there, on the bed, exactly where she had seen it the day before. "Why is it out?" The question echoed in her mind. Clara had never been someone who believed in the supernatural, but something felt deeply wrong. Slowly, she began walking around the room, her eyes scanning every detail. The dolls on the shelf, the carefully aligned storybooks, the small lamp by Luisa's bed. Everything looked exactly as she had left it, but the atmosphere was oppressive, as though the space was saturated with something unseen. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and then she heard it again, a soft whisper coming from the corner of the room. "Mom?" The voice was clear, more real than ever. Clara took a step back, panic beginning to take hold of her body. Her eyes darted around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the motionless toys and the silent walls. Trembling, she fled the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound of the door echoed through the house, and Clara felt her heart hammering in her chest. "I'm losing my mind," she thought, her hands shaking as she gripped the doorknob tightly. It was impossible, there was no other explanation. But even as she tried to rationalize it, the fear clung to her, stuck to her skin like a shadow. Clara began to doubt herself. What if Luisa was really there? What if I was ignoring something? The thought terrified her. As irrational as it was, something inside her was starting to believe. The days that followed brought Clara a restlessness she couldn't shake. The whispers from Luisa's room became more frequent, and the sense that something was wrong, that her daughter was still present in some way, began to dominate her thoughts. More and more, she spent time standing in front of the door, her ears straining for any sign. The nights were long and sleepless, and the exhaustion began to show on her face, but she couldn't bring herself to sleep. Desperate for answers, Clara began searching for explanations. She spent hours online, looking for anything that might fit what she was experiencing. Stories of ghosts, appearances of loved ones' spirits, manifestations from the beyond. Nothing seemed to fully align with her situation. She wanted to believe it was all the product of her tired mind, but the whispers were too real, too present to ignore. That afternoon, Clara sat in the living room, surrounded by old books she had found in a local bookstore. They spoke of grief, of communication with the beyond, of rituals and lost souls. She flipped through the pages, restless, looking for any logical explanation, something that could comfort her and make sense of the experience. But the more she read, the more lost she felt. The answers seemed out of her reach, hidden in the shadows of her pain. The manifestations didn't stop. Besides Luisa's voice, Clara began to notice small movements, as if objects in the room were rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking. One day, the toy closet, which always stayed shut, appeared with its door ajar, and the teddy bears had been moved to the center of the room. Clara's stomach churned. "This can't be real," she murmured to herself, but the doubt inside her grew. The presence in Luisa's room also felt heavier, as though energy was accumulating, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Clara began to fear entering, but she couldn't stay away completely. The guilt gnawed at her. Is Luisa trying to communicate? Does my daughter need me? These questions echoed in her mind, along with the growing fear that something far more sinister was at play. Each night, Clara lay down, waiting for the whispers to return, and each time they sounded clearer. Now, there was something else in Luisa's voice. Something frightened. Unable to bear the weight of uncertainty any longer, Clara decided to delve deeper into the history of the house. That presence wasn't just a product of grief. She knew the house held old secrets, and with that in mind, she climbed up to the attic, which she hadn't visited in years. The stairs creaked beneath her feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air as she pushed open the heavy door. The attic was dark and claustrophobic, filled with old furniture covered in sheets and boxes of forgotten papers and mementos. She began rummaging through, looking for anything that might offer her answers. Almost ready to give up, Clara found a small wooden box hidden deep in an old chest. Inside were letters and diaries, all dated decades ago. As she leafed through the yellowed pages, the content of the letters became more disturbing with each line. The letters spoke of a family that had lived there many years ago. The owner of the letters, a woman named Calina, described the tragedy of losing her young son Tomas in an accidental drowning. But what most caught Clara's attention was what came after. Calina claimed she could hear Tomas's voice in the house, just as Clara now heard Luisa's. The woman, increasingly desperate, reported that Tomas's spirit was trapped, crying for help, but that something else, a dark presence, was in the house, manipulating her son's spirit and preventing him from finding peace. A cold chill ran down Clara's spine. Could that entity still be here? The idea that a malevolent force was feeding on her pain and keeping Luisa trapped was unbearable, but it made sense. Helena's description was eerily familiar. The whispers, the moved toys, the sensation of being watched. Clara kept reading, her hands trembling. In Helena's final diary, there was mention of a ritual. She believed the only way to free Tomas's soul was to confront the entity directly. Clara read the details of the ritual carefully. Candles, symbols drawn on the floor, words spoken to the wind. But the diary didn't end well. The last entry was confused and abruptly cut off, with scribbles that suggested a sudden and violent end to Helena's attempt. Desperate, Calina had failed to free her son. Clara closed the diary, her heart heavy. What if it's true? What if Luisa is also trapped? The questions burned inside her, mixing fear with guilt. Despite her initial skepticism, Clara was now willing to do anything to save her daughter's soul. She needed to try the ritual. Taking a deep breath, she glanced around, making her final decisions. If there's any chance to free Luisa, I have to try, no matter the cost. That same night, Clara prepared everything for the ritual. Following Helena's instructions, she carefully drew the symbols on the floor with chalk, forming a circle around the center of the room. She placed the candles around the drawings and lit them one by one, their faint glow casting dancing shadows across the walls. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Clara knelt at the center of the circle, her trembling hands clutching a photograph of Luisa. As she repeated the words she had read in the diary, a sense of dread overwhelmed her, tightening her chest. What if I'm making a mistake? What if it's not Luisa, but something worse that I'm releasing? But it was too late to turn back. Whatever was in that house, she had to face it. The atmosphere around her began to shift. The candle flames flickered violently, as if an invisible wind was blowing through them, and a biting cold wrapped around Clara. Suddenly, she heard Luisa's voice again, now louder and clearer. "Mom, help me." The plea was filled with fear, and Clara felt tears running down her face. "My daughter, I'm here, I'll help you." But then the atmosphere changed abruptly. A dense, malevolent presence filled the room, and Clara felt the air around her compress, making it hard to breathe. The figure of Luisa began to materialize before her, but something was wrong. The image of the girl appeared distorted, her features twisted into something not entirely human. Clara tried to approach, but an invisible force held her back, trapping her in place. Suddenly, beside Luisa's form, other shapes began to appear. Children. Small, deformed bodies with vacant faces and dark eyes watched Clara from the other side of the circle. Tomas, she thought, recognizing one of the faces from Helena's descriptions. They were all there, the souls trapped by the entity that fed on their pain. Luisa's figure reached out her arms toward Clara, as if begging for help. Clara felt an almost irresistible urge to step out of the circle, to hold her daughter, to bring her back. But deep down, she knew this wasn't really Luisa. The true spirit of her daughter was being used by the entity, and giving into that impulse would condemn her forever. With a final cry of desperation, Clara repeated the ritual's words, forcing herself to stay focused, even as her heart broke. The children's forms began to distort, like shadows in the light. And then, with a sigh of relief, they vanished. The oppressive presence in the room dissolved, leaving Clara alone, in silence. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara remained kneeling on the floor, her eyes wide and her body exhausted. The room was once again empty, with no sign of the children or the oppressive presence that had once dominated it. The candles still flickered slightly, but the cold and the weight of the atmosphere had vanished, as though the house had finally been freed from an invisible prison. For a long moment, Clara stayed there, unable to stand. The sense of loss overwhelmed her. Luisa, her sweet girl, was gone forever. Even knowing that she had done what was necessary to free her daughter's soul, the emptiness inside her was immense. There was no way to bring Luisa back, and now, more than ever, Clara had to accept that painful reality. The sacrifice hadn't been physical, but emotional. The last bond tying her to her daughter had been severed. Finally, Clara stood up. Luisa's room now felt different, less oppressive, quieter in a peaceful way. The guilt was still there, but it was mixed with a slight sense of peace. She glanced around one last time, knowing she couldn't stay in that house much longer. The memories were unbearable, but the terror she had faced there made it impossible to continue living in that place. In the days that followed, Clara began packing her things. She decided to sell the house and seek a new life elsewhere. She knew she would carry the experience and the pain with her, but there was something liberating about leaving that place behind. When she finally closed the front door, a sense of relief washed over her, but even so, the weight of grief still followed her steps. Clara took one last look at the house as she slowly walked down the road. The old facade, now cloaked in shadows, seemed peaceful, as though the secrets it held had finally been laid to rest. But no matter how hard she tried, Clara couldn't completely shake the weight that clung to her chest. Something inside her knew that, despite having freed Luisa, the house still held a part of that horror. As the wind blew through the branches of the trees, a final whisper echoed inside Luisa's now empty room. "Mom." The words, soft and fragile, disappeared into the silence that filled the house. A forgotten toy in the corner of the room moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if something was still there, waiting. The house, wrapped in its emptiness, waited for its next story.